Michael's phone buzzed relentlessly on the counter, pulling him away from the patient chart he was reviewing. He sighed, grabbed it, and glanced at the screen. Private number. Normally, he would ignore it, but something made him pick up this time. Dr. Miller? The voice on the other end was urgent, clipped. This is Dr. Hayes from County General. Your father, John Miller. There's been an incident. Michael's heart dropped. What happened? A collapse at the factory. He's stable, but you need to come. Now. The line went dead, leaving Michael frozen in place. The bustle of the hospital suddenly muffled around him. His father, the man who had worked every day of his life to build a future for him, lying in a hospital bed? It didn't compute. The drive to County General blurred past him, memories flashing like signs on the highway. John Miller, with his awkward, endearing smile and gentle way of speaking, had always been the unshakable pillar of Michael's life. Born with Down syndrome, his father wasn't what society expected of a breadwinner, but he had defied every odd, working tirelessly at the food factory for over 2 decades. Michael could still hear his father's voice from years ago, echoing through their small living room. Education is the most important thing, Mikey. You're going to be someone who helps people. As Michael rushed into the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant stung his nostrils. He spotted Dr. Hayes in the corridor. The older man looked solemn. He's conscious, but we're running tests. There's something we need to discuss. Something? Michael's voice wavered. Dr. Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder. Come with me. They entered a dimly lit room where John lay on the bed, his features pale but his eyes brightening at the sight of his son. Mikey! John's voice was hoarse but full of love. Michael swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Hey, Dad, you gave me a scare. I'm okay, John said with that same reassuring grin, though his hand trembled as it reached for Michael's. But the warmth of the reunion was shattered when Dr. Hayes stepped in. John's tests show more than exhaustion. There are signs of long-term strain on his heart. Michael's stomach twisted. What does that mean? It means we need to act quickly. He's been ignoring symptoms for years. Michael turned to his father, his voice breaking. Dad, why didn't you say anything? John's gaze fell to his hands, his silence screaming louder than words. Let's give you 2 a moment, Dr. Hayes said, leaving the room. Michael gripped his father's hand tighter. You've spent your whole life making sure I was okay. It's my turn now. Promise me, Dad. No more hiding. John nodded, tears welling in his eyes. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was more his father wasn't telling him. As the machines beeped steadily in the background, Michael's mind churned. What had his father been carrying all these years? And at what cost? Michael sat by his father's bedside, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor a cruel reminder of John's fragility. For as long as he could remember, his father had been invincible. Someone who shrugged off exhaustion with a laugh, who never let his limitations define him. Now, for the first time, Michael saw the cracks beneath the surface, and it terrified him. Son, John said softly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the machines. Don't look so worried. I've been through worse. Michael wanted to believe him, but the weight in his father's eyes told a different story. He squeezed John's hand, searching for words, when the door creaked open. Michael! It was Amelia, his mother, clutching her purse tightly to her chest. Her face was drawn, and her usual calm demeanor wavered as she looked between her son and her husband. Mom! Michael stood, and Amelia stepped into his embrace. Her arms lingered longer than usual, as if she needed his strength. How bad is it? She whispered, pulling away to glance at John. Heart strain, Michael replied. Years of ignoring symptoms, apparently. Amelia's shoulders sagged, and she lowered herself into the chair opposite John. For a moment, no one spoke. The room felt heavy, the silence amplifying the unspoken fears between them. Then Amelia broke it. There's something you should know, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Michael frowned. What do you mean? Amelia hesitated, her gaze fixed on John. Your father, he didn't just work long hours to put you through school. He gave up something precious. John shook his head, his eyes wide. Amelia, Don't. He deserves to know, she insisted, her tone firm. Turning to Michael, she continued, years ago, when you were 10, John qualified for a program at the factory. It would have given him a safer position and better hours, but it came with a catch. It meant cutting back his work time and earning less. We couldn't afford that with your tuition on the horizon. Michael's chest tightened. So he stayed where he was? In that grueling job? Amelia nodded. He said your education was worth any price, even if it cost him his health. Michael stared at his father, his throat tightening. The quiet sacrifices John had made were staggering, and Michael had never known the full extent of them. I'd do it all again, John said, his voice breaking. You were my dream, Mikey. Seeing you as a doctor? It was worth everything. Before Michael could respond, Amelia reached into her purse and pulled out a weathered leather journal. She handed it to him with trembling hands. He's kept this for years. Maybe it'll help you understand just how much he's given. Michael opened the journal to the first page, his father's unmistakable handwriting filling the lines. The words hit him like a tidal wave. If I don't make it to see you graduate, know this. Every step I took, every dollar I earned, was for you, Michael. You're my miracle. Michael's hands shook as he turned the page, each entry revealing more about John's struggles, fears, and unwavering love. But then he noticed something strange. A series of numbers scrawled at the bottom of one entry, like an address. What is this? He asked, holding up the journal. Amelia's brow furrowed. I don't know. He never mentioned it to me. John looked away, his lips pressing into a thin line. Michael's heart pounded. There was more to his father's story, something he wasn't saying, and he was determined to find out. Michael spent the night poring over the journal, every word like a window into a life he hadn't fully understood. His father's entries were a mix of heartbreak and resilience. Notes about grueling factory shifts, whispered dreams of seeing Michael in a white coat, and quiet fears of not living long enough to witness it. But it was the address, scrawled hastily at the bottom of one entry, that refused to leave his mind. The next morning, after ensuring his father was stable, Michael decided he couldn't wait any longer. Mom, stay with Dad. I need to check something, he said, holding up the journal. Amelia nodded, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern, but she didn't press. The address led Michael to the edge of town, to a small, unassuming house with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox. He hesitated at the door, his mind racing with possibilities. Was this a place his father had worked? Someone he knew? What could be so important that John had recorded it alongside his most personal thoughts? Finally, he knocked. The door opened a crack, and an elderly man peered out. His weathered face softened when he saw the journal in Michael's hands. You must be John's boy, the man said, stepping back to let him in. Michael blinked, caught off guard. You know my father? The man chuckled softly. Know him? I owe him my life. Come in. Inside, the house was small but meticulously kept, filled with the faint smell of coffee and old books. The man gestured for Michael to sit and poured him a cup before settling into a chair across from him. My name's Arthur, he began. I worked with your dad at the factory for years, but what I owe him goes beyond work. Michael leaned forward, clutching the cup tightly. What do you mean? Arthur sighed, his gaze distant. About 15 years ago, the factory was on the verge of layoffs. I was on the chopping block, a single dad with 2 kids at home. Your father, he volunteered to take a pay cut so I could keep my job. Michael's chest tightened. He never mentioned this. He wouldn't, Arthur said with a small smile. John never wanted recognition. He just cared about people. Said his boy was going to grow up and do something great, and that was all that mattered. Michael sat back, the weight of Arthur's words pressing down on him. His father's sacrifices ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. As Arthur continued, he revealed more about John's years at the factory, the injuries he'd shrugged off, the hours he'd worked to cover for others, and the quiet ways he'd supported his coworkers, even when it hurt him. But then Arthur's tone changed. There's one more thing you should know. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. That journal you're holding is not just for you. There's something in there meant for me too. Michael's brow furrowed. For you, Arthur nodded. Years ago, John told me if anything ever happened to him, I'd find a letter in his journal. Something he wanted me to deliver. Michael's pulse quickened as he flipped through the pages. And sure enough, tucked near the back was an envelope with Arthur's name on it. Michael handed it over, his hands shaking. Arthur opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the page. His expression shifted from surprise to sorrow, and then to resolve. What does it say? Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur folded the letter and looked at him, his gaze steady. It's about you, Michael, and it's something you need to hear. But not here. Not yet. Michael's stomach churned. Why not? Arthur stood, placing a hand on his shoulder. Because some truths need time to land. For now, just know this. Your father's love for you is bigger than anything I've ever seen. And he's made sure you'll understand that, in time, as Michael left the house, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. One thought echoed in his mind. What else had his father been carrying all these years, silently, just to protect him? The drive back to the hospital felt heavier, as if each mile added another layer to the knot tightening in Michael's chest. His thoughts churned with everything Arthur had said, each revelation sharpening the image of a father whose love knew no bounds. But the unanswered questions haunted him. What was in that letter? Why was Arthur so insistent on waiting to reveal its contents? By the time Michael reached his father's room, night had fallen. The soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminated John's face, peaceful but pale. Amelia was asleep in the chair by the window, her head tilted awkwardly against the wall. Michael pulled up a chair beside his father, his voice soft. Hey, Dad. John's eyes fluttered open, and his lips curved into a faint smile. Mikey, you're back. I went to see someone, Michael said, pulling the journal from his bag. Arthur. At the mention of the name, John's expression shifted. Surprise. Then something Michael couldn't quite place. You've been keeping secrets, Dad, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. Arthur told me about the sacrifices you made. The pay cut, the extra hours, the injuries you never mentioned. Why didn't you ever tell me? John sighed, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. Because it wasn't important. What mattered was you, son. I wanted you to have a chance. One I never had. Michael leaned forward, gripping the journal tightly. But it is important, Dad. To me. I need to understand everything you've been through. Everything you've done for me. For a moment, John was silent, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Then he looked at Michael, his eyes glistening. You're my legacy, Mikey. Every choice I made was to make sure you'd have a better life. That's all I ever wanted. Michael swallowed hard, his throat burning. Arthur said there's more. A letter. Something you wanted him to deliver if you couldn't. John's face softened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he reached out, his hand trembling as it rested on Michael's. Some things are better left for later, son. Trust me. Before Michael could press further, the monitor beside the bed emitted a sharp beep. His heart jumped as a nurse rushed in, checking John's vitals. We need to monitor him closely, the nurse said, her voice calm but firm. His heart rates irregular. Michael stepped back, his chest tightening as he watched his father close his eyes, his expression strained. As the nurse adjusted the four, Amelia woke, her eyes darting to John before settling on Michael. What's happening? His heart, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's getting worse. Amelia covered her mouth, her tears spilling over as she moved to John's side. Michael felt helpless, torn between staying in the room and the weight of the unanswered questions burning in his mind. Finally, he turned to leave, his fists clenched. He needed air, space to think. Outside the hospital, the cold night wrapped around him like a shroud. He pulled the journal from his bag, flipping through the pages under the dim streetlights. His eyes landed on the address again, and this time something clicked. Arthur's words echoed in his mind. Your father's love for you is bigger than anything I've ever seen, and he's made sure you'll understand that, in time. Michael gritted his teeth. He didn't want to wait. His father's time might be running out, and whatever truth lay hidden in that letter could change everything. But Arthur had been clear. It wasn't just about the letter. There was more, something his father had shielded for decades. Michael stared at the journal, the weight of it heavier than ever. The answers were close, but for now they seemed just out of reach. Michael returned to his father's room early the next morning, the journal still in his hands. The night hadn't brought clarity, only a restless tide of questions. His father was awake, though his breathing was labored. Amelia sat beside him, holding his hand, her eyes red but determined. "Dad," Michael began, pulling the chair close, "I can't keep ignoring this. I know there's something more you're not telling me." John's gaze softened as he looked at his son. "You're so much like your mother," he said with a weak smile. "Stubborn as a mule when it matters." Amelia chuckled through her tears. "He gets that from you, John." Michael didn't smile. "Please, Dad, I need to know." John hesitated, his eyes darting to Amelia, then back to Michael. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but it's not easy to talk about, Mikey." Amelia leaned forward, her grip on John's hand tightening. "It's time, John. He deserves to know." John took a deep breath, his voice trembling. "There's a reason I've kept some things hidden. Not because I wanted to lie to you, but because I didn't want you carrying my burdens." Michael's chest tightened. "What burdens?" "Years ago," John began, his voice heavy with emotion, "when you were still a baby, I was offered a chance to leave the factory. A desk job, a supervisor role. Better hours, better pay. But it came with a condition." Michael frowned. "What condition?" John's hands trembled as he continued. "They wanted me to agree that I'd never have more children. They said it was a liability, that my condition might make things complicated." Michael's stomach churned. "They wanted you to sign something like that?" John nodded. "I refused. And because of that, they didn't just deny me the promotion. They made my life harder, cut my hours, gave me the worst shifts, the heaviest loads. But I couldn't let them dictate how I lived my life." Michael's voice shook. "You gave up everything for me." John smiled faintly. "I didn't give up anything, son. I chose you. Every time." Tears burned Michael's eyes, but before he could respond, John reached out, his frail hand brushing Michael's cheek. "There's one more thing, Mikey." Michael leaned closer, his heart pounding. "In the journal," John said, his voice a whisper now, "there's a note for you. It's near the back." Michael quickly flipped through the pages, his hands trembling until he found it. A single sheet of paper, folded neatly. He opened it, his father's handwriting scrawled across the page. "Mikey, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't tell you in person. But know this, every sacrifice I made was worth it. You are my greatest joy, my miracle. And though I may not be here to see what you'll do next, I know it will be extraordinary. Remember, you carry my love with you always. Never let anyone tell you what you're worth. You're worth everything." Michael's vision blurred as he read the words, his father's unwavering love etched into every line. He looked up to see John watching him, his smile faint but full of pride. "Thank you, Dad," Michael whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything." John's eyes closed, his hand falling to the bed as the monitor beside him emitted a steady, unbroken tone. Michael froze, the journal slipping from his grasp. Amelia let out a soft cry, her head bowing over John's still hand. The world seemed to stop, the weight of loss settling over Michael like a tidal wave. But as he sat there, his father's final words echoed in his mind. "You're my miracle." And in that moment, Michael understood. His father's love wasn't bound by time or circumstance. It was a legacy, one that would guide him through the rest of his life. Like the story? Subscribe, like, and comment. See you in the next video.